Welcome to this presentation on how we ought to live life once we are baptized into the body of Christ. Catholics believe and teach that God's love and grace saves us. Love, however, requires a response, and grace is of no avail unless we cooperate with God's action in our life. In this presentation, we will talk about how a Christian ought to live in response to God's loving grace. Human beings are different from other animals in that we have an intelligence that allows us to understand ourselves and the world around us as a sign of God's love and grace. We can exercise beautiful virtues and selfless acts of care for others. Those virtues include justice, courage, temperance, and prudent judgment. Or we can lie, cheat, murder, and steal. We call that sin. Our intelligence is expressed in our conscious understanding of what is good and what is evil. Religion helps us to anchor our understanding in a real vision of a grace-filled humanity. Monsignor Jeremiah McCarthy, a priest in the Diocese of Tucson, will speak about what it means to be a human person, the nature of our conscience, the anatomy of a moral act, and how we can take an understanding of moral principles and put them into a practical application in our life. Consider the following film about moral action. After Monsignor McCarthy concludes his discussion, we will discuss the boy's reaction to the young girl from an understanding of what makes us a human, a person in the image and likeness of God.
Come ti chiami?
Pietro, Fulvio, Domenico,
Quanti anni hai?
11, 9 e mezzo, 7, 8,
Che vuoi fare da grande?
il pompiere, il calciatore, il pasticcere, il poliziotto, il pizzaiolo.
Perché?
Perché voglio costruire la casa dei miei sogni. Perché mi piace guardare. Salvo le persone, che mi piace la pizza.
E lei è Martina. Che ti piace di lei?
Gli occhi mi piacciono. Le sue scarpe, le sue mani, i suoi occhi, i suoi capelli. Sensibilità solo i capelli. Tutto. Sarebbe una bambina. Mi fidanzerei.
E ora falle una carezza. Falle una boccaccia. E ora dalle uno schiaffo. Uno schiaffo forte. Uno schiaffo. Dai. No?
No. No. Non ce la do. No. No.
No? E perché no?
Perché lei è femmina. Non ce la posso mai dare. Perché le femmine non si picchiano. Perché così si fa male. E perché Gesù non vuole far picchiare. Prima cosa è bellina e non glielo posso dare. Perché è una ragazza. Perché sono contraria alla violenza. Si dice anche le donne non si devono toccare nemmeno con un fiore. E perché è brutto. Oppure con un mazzo di fiori. E perché sono.
This film went viral on the internet in the last couple of years. At the heart of this scene is the moral decision-making of the young boys. Making choices for how we ought to live is what separates human beings from animals. What does moral decision-making reveal about what it means to be a human being? Monsignor Jeremiah McCarthy explains the Christian view of the human person.
Who am I? How am I supposed to live? It's a great question we all have to face as human persons. And we have a wonderful vision of what it means to be a human person from the Scriptures. The book of Genesis reminds us that God has fashioned us in His own image and likeness. He's created us male and female. And so each of us, in our own distinctive ways, reflects the divine image. And we are empowered with wonderful gifts and skills that liken us to God. One of the great capacities that we have is our intelligence, our ability to think and to reason. St. Thomas Aquinas also tells us that it's because we can think, because we can reason, that we participate in God's plan, God's ordering of the universe. And so that intelligence enables us to understand who we deeply are. We're not just simply persons with wonderful minds and intelligence. We're also human animals. We have great physical powers that are embodied in our physical strength. They're embodied in our emotions and our feelings. And the great vision of humanity that's there in the Bible and is certainly there in our Catholic tradition is this integration of our minds and our bodies. Our spirits, if you will, and our bodies come together. And so learning how to live well is learning how to live in a holy way. There's a wonderful Swiss psychiatrist who's a priest by the name of Father Joseph Goldbrunner, and he says that holiness is wholeness. And I think that's a wonderful image, that our holiness is in a life of integration, of bringing together our minds and our bodies and living a complete life, a happy life, a life that's filled with reaching out to others, a life that allows us to use our energies to build up one another, to build up the world that God has given to us. And so the moral life then, I think, is just simply an invitation to reflect deeply upon how we use these powers, these skills, these capacities, these energies that God has placed within us. Father Ron Rolheiser, a wonderful oblate priest, speaks about holy longings, those desires that we have, these desires for love, for meaning, for purpose, and for joy. And so those holy longings also show us the pathway to a good, happy, moral, spiritual life.
Our intelligence empowers us to understand ourselves and the world around us. Our intelligent, conscious personhood is in part makes us creatures in the image and likeness of God. Our desire to be happy and good can draw us into a deeper relationship with God. In order for the human person to examine themselves and make moral choices, a good and properly formed conscience is needed. Conscience is a judgment of practical reason that helps us to recognize and seek what is good and to reject what is evil. Conscience is at the core of our humanity.
A very important concept that we need to pay attention to as we think about our journey with the Lord, our moral life, our spiritual life, is the notion of conscience. There's a beautiful expression of conscience from the great document on the church in the modern world from the Second Vatican Council. It has the opening words, joy and hope, Gaudium et Spes. But in that beautiful document, the bishops have this to say about conscience. They say that conscience is the innermost core and sanctuary of the human person. There we are alone with God, whose voice echoes in our hearts. Isn't that a wonderful expression? That deep sense of intimacy, of our deep sense of who we are, our deep commitment to knowing the good, not only up here intellectually, but also in our hearts. It's a knowledge that weds our intellect to our heart, and so it requires formation. Conscience is not just simply doing whatever you want, whenever you want. as not just simply a whimsical expression, but conscience is really a deep invitation to commit ourselves to owning the good that we desire. And so a person of good conscience is a person who listens deeply to truth, to wisdom. And a well-formed conscience is a conscience that is shaped by guidance from others. It requires us to reflect deeply upon the truth, to allow that truth to seep into our very bones, if you will. And when we think about persons of conscience who have given great witness to it, think about persons like St. Thomas More, who was a great citizen of the church during the time of the Reformation, who felt that he, in conscience, could not sign the oath of supremacy to King Henry VIII, and willingly went to his death rather than violate that deep truth that he owned in his own conscience. Think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his wonderful letter from the Birmingham jail, in which he so beautifully says that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And Martin Luther King Jr., deeply committed to nonviolent action on behalf of justice, allows that deep truth in his own conscience to shape the contours of his life. So conscience then is a capacity that we have to acknowledge our responsibility for our deepest decisions. Think about conscience as my ability to take responsibility for my choices. It's kind of where, this is where the buck stops. The bottom line is my conscience.
The buck stops here. It means that we take responsibility for what we do. Conscience is the innermost sanctuary of our very self. In conscience, we push past our feelings alone to a sincere understanding of how we choose to live. By wedding our intelligence to our heart, we have the obligation of understanding our desires, good and bad, and fearlessly examining how we choose to spend life. To be a person of conscience, like Thomas More and Martin Luther King Jr., we need to understand something fundamental about the moral act. We must take responsibility for our actions by understanding our intentions, the ends we seek, our acts, and how our acts affect those around us. Monsignor McCarthy describes our Catholic moral tradition concerning the nature of the moral act based on the object or act we desire, the end we seek, and the circumstances that can make our actions grace-filled or regrettable as Christians.
You know, as we think about the moral life, which is our response to God's love, Father Bernard Haring talks about the moral life as God's call and our response to that. But the moral life is lived out in very concrete, ordinary things that we do. And let me give you an example. There are three components that go into a basic moral act. And let me give you an example, which is the knife entering the skin. Just think about that for a moment. Is that something that's good or bad? And as you think about it, the knife entering the skin, I suspect that the natural question that you ask is, I need more information about that. The knife entering the skin is what we call the object or the item that we're considering. So that's what's on the table for discussion is the object. In order for us to understand whether that object is a right thing or a wrong thing to do, we need two other elements to help us sort things out. And we need to know why the knife is entering the skin. That's called the end of the act. So, let me give you another example. Suppose you're at the bank and you feel a knife coming into your skin. Well, that person who's putting the knife into you might be the bank robber, which is the end of stealing your wallet. So that is something very important to know whether this is a good moral act. On the other hand, that knife going into your skin might be the doctor who has you on the operating table to take out the cancerous tumor that you have, which would be a good thing, wouldn't it? So the object, the knife entering the skin, the end or the purpose, the doctor's purpose to try and heal you, the bank robber's purpose is to take your wallet, help you to get a sense of whether the action is good or bad. And the third element that we also need to take into account are what are the other elements that surround it, that we call the circumstances. So the fact that the act is taking place in a hospital setting with caregivers allows us to have a deeper sense of the meaning of the action. The fact that the action is taking place in a setting where I may be harmed, in other words, the bank robber is taking my wallet, qualifies the action. So again, object, end, and circumstances are three important elements that help us to make that discernment, that deeper understanding about whether an action is good or bad.
Catholic understanding of the moral act is merely information unless we recognize it as a helpful guide in our journey of life and put that information into practical action. If ever you are lost in the desert and every sand dune looks like the next, the smartest thing to do is to try to find some object to navigate by. It could be the North Star at night. That would be smart. If you just decide to walk in a particular direction, you probably will become disoriented and will most likely walk in circles. Without a sound guide to navigate by, like a good conscience, you can go in circles in life also. Religion is more than merely interesting information. Religion is the anchor of a healthy spiritual life. If we choose to follow our desires only without an intelligent examination of where they are leading us, we will go around in circles, or worse. Putting our Catholic religion into practice requires us to take a sound understanding of the moral act and implement it in our life. We Catholics call this an examen, or the examination of conscience.
There's a wonderful observation by Brother Gabriel Moran, who talks about God's great desire to have communion with us. And he says that God reveals his deepest self to us as a means of communion-seeking self-disclosure. So God is constantly revealing God's self to us in the very ordinary experiences of our daily lives. So one of the great gifts of our Catholic tradition is recognizing that the incarnation of the Lord, the Word made flesh, the gift of the creation, that everything is a bearer of God's grace. Everything is touched by the hand of God. And so one of the opportunities that we have in our lives is to step back for a moment to reflect and think about where God's grace, God's presence is touching us. And a very important tool that we have available to us in our Catholic tradition, our spiritual tradition, is what we call an examination of conscience, or an examen. And the evening prayer of the Church makes that as part of the practice of the end of a day, to think back on the events of the day. Where did we find God present to us? What were the high points of the day? Can we think about moments of encounter, actions that we performed that demonstrated to us perhaps God's kindness, that we were kind to someone, that we were charitable? And if we can begin to reflect upon that as a way of helping us understand our journey towards the Lord. An examination of conscience can also help us identify maybe those occasions during the day when perhaps we weren't at our best. Maybe we didn't take the opportunity to be kind or generous. Maybe we failed to do something that was an opportunity for us to register goodness to another person. So an examination of conscience is a way for us to begin to see the hand of God in our lives, and what St. Ignatius of Loyola describes as finding God in all things. And so the examination of conscience is not an exercise in fault finding. It's not an exercise in beating our breasts about what we did or didn't do, but rather it's really a deeper invitation to see that we belong to God at every moment of life, that our lives are a blessed encounter with God. And so our experience of grace is present in these very ordinary things that otherwise we may tend to think as being only ordinary things. You know, the old Baltimore Catechism had a beautiful expression called an occasion of grace. And by that it meant ordinary things like the love of our parents, the colleagues that we meet at work, the encounters with our children and the family, the dinner table, our Our moments of prayer, of quiet reflection, of contemplation, all of these are occasions of grace, and our examination of conscience can lift that up for us.
So what did you think about the film we showed you at the beginning about the little boys and the girl? What struck you most about their actions? The little boys were willing to admire her beauty, and they did not hesitate, although nervously, to caress her. They also were willing to make funny faces. But when they were asked to strike her, they hesitated and then refused. There is a moral sense in those boys. There is a sense that there are certain things you do not do. And so we would say, do all possible good and avoid doing harm. The reasons the boys gave for not hitting the little girl were varied. One said, "You don't hit girls, not even with a flower." My favorite reason was the reason that the last boy gave.
È perché sono uomo.
The boy said he didn't hit the girl because I am a man. The moral life defines us as human beings. When our moral life is directed towards the imitation of Christ, it's directed towards the presence of God within us. The philosopher Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. Examining our lives with Christ in mind is to fix our mind and hearts on a sure guide. Our understanding of the moral act is a guide to self-examination. The three-part understanding of the moral act directs our self-reflection to the object of our act, the end or intention we have in mind, and the circumstances of our day. It keeps us from walking in circles. The examine, or the examination of conscience, looks for the presence of God in what we intend to do, the object of what we're trying to do, and how it is that we try to put that into practice in the practical circumstances of our life. Try this. For a moral exercise, download an examination of conscience and examine this day. Don't live your life in an unexamined manner.